This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. We're thrilled today to be joined by brilliant David Pivnick. And David requires us to use the descriptor brilliant before his name. It's part of his contract. No, he actually is brilliant, and he doesn't require that. We're going to talk today about a subject that David is oh so knowledgeable about business, politics, and sports. David, let's tee off by talking a little bit about USA, Canada, and the NHL sort of all-star extravaganza, and how the NHL has done a great job of making itself relevant again. And what are your thoughts on the Canadian-USA rivalry? Is this all really just great fun for them? Are they really that competitive? What's the gist of what's your take on this, the Canada-USA rivalry that's going on in the NHL All-Star Weekend?
Yeah, great question. Love to talk about it. And I want to start by I want to touch on what you said at the beginning, which is the NHL got something right, which I think is something we can all be, as hockey fans, be excited about and also somewhat shocked, because the NHL constantly steps on its own feet and falls all over itself to do the absolutely worst thing for growing the sport and building the brand of hockey in the NHL and gaining popularity in the States. And they finally did something so right, and they deserve credit. And I love the fact that, at the beginning of last week, right after the Super Bowl, there was a lot of media discussion about how stupid the NHL was for, canceling games effectively for 2 weeks, right in the lull after football, and not capitalizing on that gap in the sports scene. And instead, this Four Nations thing has just been a smash success. The ratings are through the roof, and people are talking about hockey in a way that basically never happened. So as you can tell, I'm pretty pumped about it, and I have to tip my cap to the NHL because they, like I said, consistently get lampooned for doing the wrong thing and not growing the sport, and they absolutely, this was a slam dunk or a great slap shot, as the case would be. Very well done. In terms of the game coming up, look, clearly the U.S. Canada hockey rivalry, so to speak, which I think has become much more of a real rivalry in recent years. Like, Canadians love to point to the historic records, but it's starting to narrow over the last few years, and particularly at the World Junior level, where the U.S. team continues to have increased success, and the Canadian team has had a couple rough years in the last few go-rounds. It's great to see. This is going to be more of a rivalry and more of an even rivalry in the future. I think that the U.S. team coming into the tournament, I think we talked about this before. I said I thought they had the best defense and also the best goaltending. That has certainly held up as the tournament has progressed. And I thought Canada's forwards were the strongest, which they have sort of gone back and forth depending on the game. They looked pretty anemic versus the U.S. on Saturday. So I think tomorrow's game is going to be a great game. I think McAvoy being out on defense for the U.S. hurts quite a bit. And I'm expecting Canada to come out pretty inspired, even on the road in Boston, and to get the win tomorrow night. But I expect it to be a pretty tight and exciting game to watch.
Thank you very, very much. And what about the political overtones? Is this all a lot of hype, or has President Trump made an error in sort of picking a fight we don't need to have? Because obviously, you're our expert on Canadian-American relationships. You're the sort of the guru, the expert, the genius on that area. How much has President Trump's language amped this up, where you have Canadians booing the American anthem? Is this all good fun, or is it going to turn into what's happening, sort of the soccer hooliganism type stuff, where you start to have fights between Americans and Canadians, which seems so stupid? And if we have fights between Americans and Canadians, are you like the Tchuks that have to pick one side or the other? And am I pronouncing Tkachuk right? I'm not sure I'm not, but they're like, their mother's Canadian, their father's American. They've chosen to suit up for the USA. You're a Canadian and American. Do you have inner conflict?
I have some inner conflict, actually. I will say I like both teams, and if they were playing anyone else, it'd be easy to know who I was cheering for. This game's a little bit tough. It's Tkachuk. You were sort of close. I think you managed to mispronounce it two different ways, but you were in the ballpark, which is good. And I do think for them, playing for the same country their father played for it. Obviously, their dad, Keith Tkachuk, had a great career, makes a lot of sense. And those guys are kind of the heart and soul of the U.S. team. I'm sure you've seen, they were texting, the two of them, Matt Tkachuk and Brady were texting with JT Miller and basically agreed before the game they were going to drop the mitts and get a fight going to sort of kick things off. So I view that less as a critique on the booing and the anthem and more on them rallying behind the Stars and Stripes and wanting to send the right message in a big game for their team, which, it's a fun part of hockey, whether you like fighting in the game or not. And so I'm glad that they kicked it off in that way. In terms of your more political question, I mean, look, we've talked about President Trump's statements on Canada before. I think much of it is hyperbole that's not likely to lead anywhere, but it's not ideal to create distaste in the eyes of a close friend, not just a neighboring country, but one of the greatest relationships between two countries, I think, in the world, in terms of a peaceful, unprotected border, close trade relationship, close partnership on a lot of fronts. So I think it's unfortunate from that standpoint. But I view that more through the lens of how actual items like tariffs are going to play out, rather than trying to evaluate it based on whether or not the anthem's getting booed. I think if the crowd in Montreal wants to boo the anthem, it is what it is. There's plenty of things about Montreal that I think warrant booing.
Let me ask you that question. Is Montreal and Quebec, is that still considered part of Canada, or do you, for all practical purposes, the rest of the country, consider that sort of a French Parisian outlier, or do you still consider it part of Canada? I guess that's the question.
It's a great question. I think Montreal, where most of the people also speak English and they have tried to participate in Canada more generally, is clearly part of Canada. I think there are parts of Quebec that do fancy themselves as being separate, which is why Quebec has periodically voted to separate from the country. So that's never passed, and I don't think secession will happen. But it's different parts of Quebec inspire different levels of affection amongst Canadians.
And I don't mean this in a negative way, but you're sort of a gritty, sort of blue collar acting Ontarian, a Toronto person. Do you ever feel like you're just a lot less sophisticated compared to the people from Quebec and Montreal? Just a little, and I don't mean this offensively, a little dumber than the Quebec and Montreal folks.
So I appreciate the implicit insult in there. I'm not sure if I think I'm honored to be called blue collar. I don't think I get that description a lot, although I'm a little offended you think my disdain for the Quebecois is because I don't feel smart enough to deal with them. I assure you that's not the particular problem there, but appreciate where you were going with the question.
So what is the answer? Are you okay, esteem-wise, given the difference in average intellect between Ontario and Quebec?
I mean, look, amongst the various provinces, I don't think there's a legitimate debate that Ontario is the best province. I recognize other provinces might incorrectly contest that point, or I guess citizens of other provinces. But I just think objectively, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia are the three profitable provinces that sort of drive the rest of the country. And I think Ontario and British Columbia are clearly the best of the provinces if one were ranking such things. So, with that in mind, I'm not gonna stoop to trying to dignify your question about how Quebec might feel or whether I should feel sufficient for Quebec.
So if you could actually rank the provinces from best to worst in Canada, which it seems like implicitly, I didn't realize this, that Canadians do, how do you compare British Columbia and Ontario to, let's say, Florida and California? How do they compare? I mean, as long as you're ranking and stirring up trouble in such a incomprehensible way, compare them to some of the U.S. states. Where does British Columbia? Let's compare it to Texas because they're both big oil wealth like areas. What's your sense? I mean, you can't really compare Ontario to a state in the U.S. that has real commerce, but let's compare it to like North Dakota. How do you compare Ontario to North Dakota, and how do you compare British Columbia to Texas?
So let's first of all, if we're going to compare something to Texas, I think it would be Alberta. I think that's where you were trying to go with the oil. I think you've demonstrated you're confusing your Canadian states. I will also note I am thrilled, before I answer your question, that you didn't ask me to rank the remaining Canadian states, because the Canadian provinces, I apologize, because while I can list them all, once you've got past the first five, the rest kind of just get ranked together. I think there's just a group at some point, and I'll take the slings and arrows. If you have any Nova Scotian or Newfoundland listeners, they can follow up with you directly based on.
So you're like the equivalent. What we have in the U.S., and I'll try and explain this to you and educate you on this. We have in the U.S. elitists on the coast that consider certain parts of the country to be flyover states that don't matter. And you seem to be sort of a middle of the country Canadian elitist. My mistake for calling you blue collar and gritty, because I'm going to change that right now. It seemed to be calling Nova Scotia and Newfoundland sort of flyover country and irrelevant for all practical purposes.
I wouldn't use the terms flyover country or irrelevant. I'm simply stating they don't compare to Ontario. I view that as objective fact. I think they're wonderful places to live if that's where you want to live. I think, going to Dalhousie and Halifax for university could be a lovely place to go study for a few years. I have nothing against those places. No different than I have nothing against the great state of Kansas. I just don't want to live there and periodically mock one of our colleagues who used to live there. There's nothing wrong with that.
Which is the real, speaking of that, I'm going to ask you two questions. Which is the real London? London, Ontario, or London, England?
London, England, clearly.
Wow. Didn't see that.
No hesitation on that one either. London, Ontario, lovely place, but clearly not the real London. I mean, that's a softball.
Which province do you compare to Iowa, the state of Iowa?
Oh, the incomparable state of Iowa. That's a tough one. There's a few states that I think would fit in this characterization, but I'm going to go with the lovely province of Saskatchewan.
Wow. Didn't see that coming, but a great pronunciation of Saskatchewan. How do I pronounce the Tchucks? How do I pronounce their names?
Kachuk. The T is silent. It's Kachuk.
Kachuk. Got it. That's just a little bit messy. David, we've talked about.
That's a soccer player.
Yes. Very, very well played. Lionel Messi, the great soccer player. Yes, well played. David, anything else you wanted to offer our listeners today? We've talked about how the NHL got this right between Canada and the U.S. We talked about how the U.S. and Canada had 3 fights in the first 9 seconds of that game, of the last game. And is that just good fun, knowing that it's unlikely anybody's really going to get hurt? Because nobody really wants to get a jaw broken in one of these fights. They used to do that 100 years ago, where you saw guys really get hurt in these fights. But is it really sort of regulated fighting where no one's going to get that hurt? What's the sense? Because nobody really wants to have injuries here, do they?
I am certain nobody wants to have injuries. I don't view it as sort of regulated fighting. I mean, look, they're throwing punches, and you're doing it on skates and with the risk of getting thrown headfirst to the ice. So I think the guys in the NHL and the guys in this tournament all have terrific balance, and even the elite scorers have had some physical confrontations or fights at some point. Sidney Crosby's dropped the mitts probably 3 times, so they have a general sense of what they're doing, and I certainly don't think there's any intent to injure as those fights go on. But look, you get punched in the face, bare knuckles, several times in a row, it's going to hurt one way or the other. So it's a real fight.
Got it. David, again, thank you so much for visiting with us today on the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. You were fantastic. My interviewing skills today were subpar, but you were great. Thank you so much for joining us, our gritty, blue-collar, intelligent Canadian. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be on. Thanks for having me, Scott.